How is everybody? Good. So good seeing you all. I sort of had to laugh when we were going through that chant, and I was looking at my notes and I was thinking of what Terry Tempest Williams said the other couple weeks ago, where she was like, "Oh, I wish I didn't have to use notes." And I always wish I didn't have to use notes, but here we are. Well, I want to welcome you all here tonight. It's so wonderful to have the opportunity to just share together. And I want to say thank you to Roshi, who's in the cloud attending. Oh, she's here. Where? Oh, hey, Roshi. I'm so excited. Well, I just have to say thank you so much, Roshi, for your love and support over many years and to all of us, really. And creating this space that is just so beautiful that we can all be in together. So thank you so much. So a few months ago, I was able to travel to Bermuda with my mom, and we hadn't been back in, I mean, many, many years. It's where I was born. And we stayed in this really beautiful place that was right at the edge of this bay. And I got up one morning around 3:30 and walked outside, and it was just so beautiful. The temperature was like 68 degrees. And I looked up in the sky, and similar to this background, it was just stark black. And the constellations up in the sky looked so beautiful. You could see the Big Dipper, the Little Dipper, Orion's Belt. And it made me think of when I was a kid, my dad and I would go outside, and he loved pointing out all the constellations. And his favorite was Orion's Belt. And so since then, I've always gone out, and Orion's Belt actually comes up over Picacho most of at least the winter, and shifts up over here and comes up really early in the morning. And I always look for Orion's Belt. I feel like it's more of an anchor than a belt. You just see it and you're like, oh, everything's going to be okay. Well, um, once you see those twinkling three little stars, it's hard not to go beyond them, and you see all the stars that are out there in the universe. And you're like, wow. I mean, we're just like a little speck in this intense vastness of the universe. And recently I was reading this book by Brian Cox, who's a particle physicist, and it's called Universal, A Guide to the Cosmos. And he asks this really amazing question. He says, how do we live a finite, fragile life in an infinite, eternal universe? How do we live a finite, fragile life in an infinite, eternal universe? Now, he says there's no answer to that question. But what I want to do tonight is really explore how um, a Buddhist householder named Vimalakirti might respond to this question. And what I'm doing is I'm going back from the spring. In the spring, we started this series of foundational talks where we were, Kodo covered I forget which one you covered, Kodo. Anyway, I covered the Diamond Sutra and the Empty Bowl Sutra. And now I'm going to cover Vimalakirti. And yeah, I think it'll be an interesting exploration. Have, is there anybody here that hasn't heard of Vimalakirti? Oh, I like it. Perfect. Okay. Well, imagine that you were living 2,500 years ago in a city, and you had this wealthy merchant um, who really seemed to have it all together. And he had property, he had a family, he was charismatic. He was basically living what many of us would consider the good life. And there was something different about him, though. He could speak in the marketplace and people would really stop and pay attention to what he was saying. Or he would go into the royal palaces and even the royalty deferred to his wisdom. He would give money away to the poor. He was really interested in, um, being with the kings and being with the street sweepers, and he felt equally comfortable with everyone. And so this is Vimalakirti. And I really have an affinity for Vimalakirti because he was a householder. And so what he was doing is really trying to live a life of vow as a bodhisattva, an awakened being who was really trying to foster the awakening in everyone he met, how to awaken in this beautiful and messy life that we are all a part of. And he's the central person in the Vimalakirti Sutra, which is one of the earliest Mahayana texts. It was first written in China in 175 of the Common Era, right around the time of the Diamond Sutra, just a little bit before that. And what the Vimalakirti Sutra asks us is, how do we live with an awakened mind, not just when we're sitting, but when we're involved in the complexities every day of our life, dealing with family, raising kids, paying bills, like all of the things that we encounter, difficulties at work, whatever it may be, how do we encounter all of these complexities with a truly awakened mind? And then similar to the Diamond Sutra and the Empty Bowl Sutra, the Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom, is a central character as well as Vimalakirti. And the core of the whole text has the two of them in dialogue. And what they're talking about is wisdom, emptiness, which I'm going to use Roshi and Kaz's translation, boundlessness. Um, they're really talking about like how do we apply emptiness to our lives, and we'll talk more about the whole notion of emptiness. And actually, I should go into what emptiness is about. It's sort of our bounded thinking. The thing that we think is real is actually illusory because it's our projections of what we think is real. And its thingness is really based nothing on those, on nothing more than those projections. And boundlessness is free from our projections. And when we allow boundlessness to really work on us, then our vows as bodhisattvas co-arise and come from there. And we practice this continuous living by vow, by showing up to liberate all beings as bodhisattvas. And this is really the idea that is central to the heart of the Vimalakirti Sutra. So at the beginning of the Vimalakirti Sutra, we have the Buddha, and he's teaching to the masses, and he's in Vaishali, and that's a city that's in northern India, just due south of Kathmandu. And in another part of the city, we have the Vimalakirti, who is very sick, and he's really struggling, feeling quite fragile. I'm sure he's contemplating his old age and potentially even his thinking about death. And I'm sure you know how sickness can really do a number on you. It never shows up when you really want it. Certainly it's out of our control in many ways. We don't really understand it. And this is sort of where Vimalakirti was in thinking about his own illness. Well, the Buddha finds out that Vimalakirti is sick, and what does he do? He asks his disciples to go and check on the Vimalakirti. And funny enough, many of the disciples, they don't want to go because Vimalakirti has shown them up in the past in Dharma conversations. And, they're afraid to go because they don't want to be shown up. And Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, tells the Buddha, Vimalakirti understands all the rules of bodhisattva conduct, and nothing in the secret storehouse of the Buddhas is beyond his grasp. In wisdom and expedient means, he has mastered all there is to know. So we have this weak, vulnerable Vimalakirti who the disciples are afraid to go and see because they don't want to be outmatched by his knowledge. But Manjushri, he's like, I'll go. I mean, why not? He knows Vimalakirti's the expert, but he's fine with going. And interestingly, all of the disciples that didn't want to go and a bunch of bodhisattvas, they all go with Manjushri to Vimalakirti's house, which magically expands so that everybody can fit in there. And there are a lot of people you'll see in the book. And when Manjushri asks the Vimalakirti about his illness, the Vimalakirti has this amazing response. He says, because all living beings are sick, I am sick. If all living beings are relieved of sickness, then my sickness is mended. So think about this. You know, the Vimalakirti is not just waxing poetic. What he's doing is he's being with his illness, and he's really meeting the vulnerability that must come with it. And he's doing this in a way of showing up with awareness. And from that comes this beautiful teaching about boundlessness. And he's really dissolving the boundaries between the self and other, because his suffering, his sickness, isn't separate from our own suffering. And our suffering isn't separate from the suffering of others. And so what he's describing here is really this lived reality between the boundaries of self and others, you know, and he's telling us that it's so permeable that while he is suffering, it is the suffering of others that is also his suffering. And I think this is the notion of inner being that we hear from Thich Nhat Hanh, that all things exist in relationship. Nothing stands alone. And it's the direct experience of what Roshi and Rebecca Solnit were talking about this weekend when we referenced the chant, creations are numberless. I vow to free them. So I think of Vimalakirti's vulnerability really as a Dharma gate for all of us. Because beyond his own compassionate identification with his suffering, he's identifying with the suffering of the world. And from that, being a bodhisattva to relieve that suffering. So how might we use our own vulnerabilities to be a Dharma gate? You know, there are many times when we want to avoid feeling or being vulnerable, but how might we utilize it and allow vulnerability to arise in us with a sense of awareness and let it support our life? So I can't help but think about the story of Vimalakirti without thinking about Roshi and the recent heart surgeries that she had. And I imagine the whole heart process must have brought up, you know, significant vulnerabilities for Roshi. You know, a place where she may have encountered her own fragility, or a place where any of us might feel that we face what we can't control, or a place where we feel utterly exposed to forces that are really beyond our understanding. I mean, when I imagine what Roshi must have been going through, this is what I think about. And certainly I felt my own vulnerabilities for her. You know, my teacher was imperiled. And I think most of us know this territory of vulnerability, you know, even if it's just a simple crisis, some simple unease, or something that's catastrophic, like, say, a heart surgery, or family pressures, or work issues. We all know what this territory of vulnerability looks like. And I think the initial thing that we want to do is like armor up, hide or find some way to not be exposed to the vulnerability that we're feeling. Yet in those days leading up to Roshi going to Stanford and spending time with her, I sensed that there was something different that was going on. Through her words and her presence, I felt that she was touching her own vulnerability with the same awareness that she brings everything. And she was clearly thinking about this impending heart surgery that was about to come up, but she was also thinking about the thriving of the resident body. She was thinking about upaya, the sangha, the teachers, upaya's longevity into the future, after she would not be here. All of this was her focus. And then at Stanford, after that first surgery, when she learned that she needed a second surgery, I think she showed up to her vulnerabilities again. Cato and I FaceTimed with her, and he asked her, how are you doing with this? Like the fact that you have to go in and have a second surgery. And she said, I'm calm. I'm not afraid. I am in discomfort. And this is what I witnessed. When we are truly in touch with our vulnerability, we're not drowning in it, but we're companioning it with awareness, as I saw in Roshi. We can attune to situations with, just attune to them differently, with a sensitivity and a wisdom that a defended self cannot. And so this was, for me, the wisdom and the vulnerability that I saw in Roshi. And then a few weeks ago, she's still dealing with a lot of the recovery. I texted just to say, I hope you're feeling better. And her response was so perfectly Roshi. She's like, thank you. I'm working it, so to speak. Been interesting. So even in recovery, in facing these ongoing challenges, she's still working it, meeting whatever arises with this same quality of awareness. Not pretending it's fine, not dramatizing the difficulties of it all, but just acknowledging. It's been interesting. And I think this is what it looks like to companion vulnerability with awareness. It's not just a one-time achievement, but it's an ongoing practice of really being with what arises in the moment, just the things as they are. And this brings me to the core conversation in the Vimalakirti Sutra, and it's about boundlessness. So again, boundlessness is what we think of as real, is really just a projection, of how we see people, the beliefs that we have, our identities, how we want relationships to be. But that ultimate reality transcends all of these projections. So we have 31 bodhisattvas, and they're all trying to define, or taking turns trying to define, boundlessness. And with each step of listening to these bodhisattvas, their responses are getting much more nuanced and more sophisticated until we get to Vimalakirti and Manjushri. So they're the last two to go. When the various bodhisattvas had finished one by one giving their explanations, they asked Manjushri, how then does a bodhisattva enter the gate of boundlessness? Manjushri replied, to my way of thinking, all dharmas are without words, without explanations, without cognition, removed from all questions and answers. In this way, one may enter the gate of boundlessness. Then Manjushri said to Vimalakirti, each of us is given an explanation. Now, sir, it is your turn to speak. How does the bodhisattva enter the gate of boundlessness? At that time, Vimalakirti remained silent and did not speak a word. Manjushri sighed and said, Excellent, excellent. Not a word, not a syllable. This truly is to enter the gate of boundlessness. So, complete silence. Somehow I think that the silence says everything that those 31 others couldn't capture in words. Last week I was sitting in the Zendo and I was thinking about this silence. And it occurred to me that Vimalakirti seemed once again to recognize this profound vulnerability and to be able to express it in a way that left him completely exposed, and that vulnerability supported him in his silence. I mean, this is the guy who's, you know, got to be a number one when it comes to knowledge. He's got to win at Dharma combat. He's a teacher. I mean, he likes talking, and words really capture him. But here in his vulnerability, I imagine, thinking about his waning strength or, thinking about the impending, maybe never recovering from the sickness. He's thinking about his projections, his bounded thinking, all of the bounded thinking that's going on around him. And from that, we receive this beautiful, profound teaching of boundlessness in silence. And in that silence, he really seems ready to receive. He's being curious. He's, in a state where he doesn't need to know. And from that, there's a sense of freedom, a sense of openness and wisdom. And everyone in the community can really feel this, and it bands them together. It says at the end of the chapter that this silence and this sickness, because of that, 5,000 bodhisattvas in the assembly were all able to enter the gate of boundlessness. So I think of this silence as really an invitation for all of us, and the sickness as well. Both of those are an invitation for all of us to really be aware of and to feel our own vulnerabilities. And I'm sure you all know this, your vulnerabilities are always there. They're really always there. But it's through our vulnerabilities that I think, once we recognize them and we companion them with awareness, we can also truly and authentically inhabit our own fears and our own limitations. And hopefully through that, we come to a place of wisdom. So this is why I would say vulnerability is an amazing Dharma gate. And I know this can be quite a challenge today, especially in this political and social environment that we're in, which seems so fraught and fractured. When I see things on the news that really enrages me, or I hear things that I think are harmful or ignorant, I mean, my first response isn't, boundless compassion. It's anger or, certainly frustration. It might be defendedness, but I can't hide behind these kinds of reactions because they're only going to make it stronger. But it brings me to ask, like, how might all of our challenges really support us in going deeper? Less us versus them. Yes, less you're the enemy and I'm good. Less your truth is better than my truth, or my truth is better than your truth, whatever it may be. And really get to the place where we practice hope. We practice what Rebecca was talking about on Sunday. And in my own practice, I really try to be aware of those moments when I feel like I want to contract, or I feel like I want to hide, or you have that little voice that comes into your ear that says, oh, this is uncomfortable. Avoid it. And when I hear those things or feel that way, the first thing I want to do is ask a question, what if this discomfort that I'm feeling is really an invitation? What if this feeling of wanting to hide is really the exact place that I need to be practicing and practice as deeply as I can? So, how do we meet our vulnerabilities and feel okay in the pain, feel okay in disappointment or unhappiness? And when we do this, what can be gained? So, has anyone heard of the nonprofit Creativity for Peace? The, I think that they may still be in Santa Fe, but I think they may have moved, but they were in Santa Fe for a long time. Well, Creativity for Peace, years ago, I was on the committee that would do site visits for the Santa Fe Community Foundation. And I went to Creativity for Peace. It's out in Apache Canyon on the other side of El Dorado. I drove down this little road and I was greeted by four 16-year-old young women and the executive director. And we all went into this big room saturated with the sun and cozy couches, very real comfortable. And I met the four young women. Um, it was Lena, Batya, Maya, and Adele. And Lena was the most talkative. And she said that um, Creativity for Peace was really about bringing together Israeli and Palestinian young women to train them in how to transform violence, how to transform prejudice and anger into understanding and mutual respect. Essentially going to um, practice what we might call applied bodhisattva activity in one of the world's most entrenched conflicts. And each of them had been together at this point for 2 weeks. It was a 3-week camp where they fly them in from Israel and from Palestine, and they all meet up. And Lena said something that really struck me. She said, when we first got here, and Lena's from Palestine, she said, when we first got here, I realized my roommate was Batya, and Batya was from Israel. And she said, that never would have happened back at home. I would never have been roommates with somebody from Israel. And, but after the 2 weeks, they're friends. Like Batya and Lena were friends. And, she had paused a little bit in what she was talking about. And she said, in that moment, when I realized that, she said, I felt vulnerable. And I think about that vulnerability. It sort of hung in the air there. And like I said, after 2 weeks, they actually were friends. And so I think that this young person is really describing the exact territory that Vimalakirti is pointing to. Lena had entered a space where her own fixed ideas about who was friend and who was enemy, who is us and who is them, started to dissolve. And her bounded thinking and all of the projections she had about Israeli people was suddenly face to face with Bhatya's actual humanity. So I would say that Lena's vulnerability certainly wasn't, um, it wasn't a weakness. If anything, that vulnerability is what really allowed the transformation to enter the whole group. Because each of these young women, over the course of the 3 weeks together, really moved beyond their projections or their understandings or misunderstandings about each other's culture, and really realized that they both have, all of them have the same hopes, dreams, desires, fears. And over the years, I understood that many of these young women became friends, friends that really crossed the borders when they got back to Israel and Palestine, or at least it did. And so the hope in this program was when they returned to Israel and Palestine, that they were really the bridge builders. They were the ones who could hold both perspectives and speak across the divide because they had really had a true encounter, a genuine encounter with each other. All of them allowed themselves to be vulnerable. And I imagine that Lena's vulnerability is, similar to Vimalakirti. The ripples of her vulnerability would affect countless other people into the future. So in this sense, I felt vulnerable really became a doorway through which there could be the potential for peace. So these examples of these bridge builders, these young women coming together, you know, Roshi's vulnerability with her heart, all of that may seem really extraordinary, but you'll find that this practice of meeting vulnerability with awareness comes in, you know, very ordinary moments. For example, just sitting here in front of you is quite vulnerable. Um, But you worry about, oh, will I come across okay? Will I sound all right? Will I be smart? Whatever it is that comes up. But there's a side of me that feels like somehow sitting here, somehow showing up in front of all of you with a little bit of uncertainty, a little bit of inadequacy, I feel sort of a tenderness and for saying yes and for showing up. And I think of that for all of us, just all of us humans trying to make our way in this world and do the best we can to love and be compassionate. So recently, I had a visit. I went to see my dad, and my dad's a lovely person. But my whole adult life, I've had a really hard time having conversations with him. And it's not about him. He can have conversations, but it's more about me. And so when I went out there for the visit, I was like, I'm really going to show up. I'm going to show up to the vulnerability. I'm going to have a conversation with my dad and tell him how I really feel about things and, let there be some intimacy there. So I go out on the back porch of my parents' house, and it's an enclosed back porch. And he spends most of the year there. He's got like a lazy boy chair and looks at this TV where he's got baseball games on, and he can kind of observe the whole neighborhood, all the cars going by. And so I walk out on the back porch and I sit in a chair just on the other side of the TV. And yeah, I just sit there and I watch my dad like look out the window, and he takes a drag off of his cigarette. And not a word will come out of my mouth. And after a few minutes, my dad gets up and like he puts his cigarette out, he stands up, and there's this big, it used to be the outside door, but now it's the door into the kitchen. He opens the door, closes the door, and I'm there by myself on the porch. Not a word was shared. And I think about this and I wish somehow I had shown up to the vulnerability that I felt there and just said something, anything in words, just being able to show up to that uncomfortable space between us, hopefully next time. And I tell you this story because um, I tell you this story because I think all of us miss moments to show up to vulnerability. We're not quite able to meet it. I mean, we feel it, but we can't quite meet it. And I just want to tell you, sorry, don't let it stop you. Don't let it get you down. because those moments are really precious. So feel that vulnerability. And I think, the more that we really encounter vulnerability and we meet it with a sensitive, thoughtful awareness and show up to it, it'll support us and it'll really propel us into the future. Okay. So I want to return to Brian Cox's question that I talked about in the beginning. What does it mean to live a finite, fragile life in an infinite, eternal universe? And perhaps Vimalakirti's vulnerability suggests that the question is really the answer. I don't think that we um, resolve or solve our vulnerabilities in vastness. I mean, we really live it and embody it with our whole being right here, right now. So when I look up at Orion's belt and I think of all that connects us, everybody in this room, the experience that Roshi's had with her heart, I think about those young women um, building bridges between nations, um, the awkwardness with my dad. When I think about all of that, I think that each one of us is this brief constellation of awareness in this infinite universe. And each of us carries all the world's pain, and each of us is capable of boundless compassion, boundless wisdom, love. And it's precisely because we're open, we're all tender, and we show up to our lives. So I want to close with a poem that it came to me recently, which seems to capture what we've been exploring tonight. It's called Recognition. I woke up this morning thinking about my granddad's hands. Sorry, let me start over. I woke up this morning thinking about my granddad's hands, how they shook when he poured popcorn onto newspaper during Braves games. And a few years later, only his eyes moved, blinking rapidly to let you know how much he loved you. Tremor started in his left thumb and spread like water through everything he touched. His son or grandson may inherit that shake, the same nervous flutter rattling coffee cups against saucers, or forcing the tight grip of a steering wheel with both hands, even on straight roads. I remember watching his son, now in his 80s, standing in the kitchen early one morning, staring out at the neighbor's porch lights, pulling a long drag of smoke from his cigarette, his shoulders carved like question marks against the window. We never talked about the fear that lives in our chest, the way his breath catches when he climbs stairs, how he stops halfway, pretending to examine family photos, or the little details in watercolors I painted as a boy, buying time for the heart to slow down. But we know, the same way we know when we catch our reflections in store windows and see faces looking back, see the generations gone in us, the same deep lines around the eyes, the same way of holding worry in the jaw. There's something about being human that breaks us open from the inside, leaves us standing in doorways between what we were and what we're becoming, feeling the weight of all the love we've carried, of all the love we failed to give, or the times we contemplated loving more. Tonight, when I look up at Orion's belt, that mighty nightly anchor, at all the other stars my dad showed me years ago, I understand tenderness isn't weakness. It's the only honest response to a world that gives us everything and takes it all away, leaves us grateful and broken and somehow still breathing. Thank you.